From the colleges and universities of the nation, CBS Television brings you The search to know and understand man and his work, the search for a richer, happier life for all.
I'm Charles Romine. I'm standing here near the corner of 5th and Austin, in the heart of downtown Waco, Texas. All around me, in practically every direction, are the scars of a city. Behind me, this gutted building. And over here, this crumbling brick wall. In the next half hour, you're going to learn about a community in crisis, a city that was blitzed, struck without warning by one of the most devastating tornadoes in our history, and came back. May 11th, 1953. This is Waco, population 95,000. A quiet, residential and small industrial city, county seat and agricultural center in the heart of cotton-producing Central Texas. The Waco Municipal Airport, location of the Weather Bureau station nearest to the city. Mr. C.C. Wooden, meteorologist of the Waco station.
I was on duty here at the weather station the afternoon of May the 11th, 1953. We had been having unsettled weather conditions for the past 24 hours. A cold mass of air was moving down from the northeast, and a tropical maritime front of hot, moist air was coming up from the Gulf. This indicated to the Weather Bureau the possibility of tornadic conditions. Tornado alert warnings went out.
In the next few fatal minutes, the twister raged through the southwest residential district, gaining force and momentum as it swept toward the busy downtown area. Downtown Waco at 4:35 p.m. The same area 2 minutes later. I'm here with Dr. Harry E. Moore of the Sociology Department of the University of Texas. Dr. Moore, why are you here in Waco, Texas?
Well, we are doing a study of the tornadoes that hit Waco and San Angelo last year.
I see. Now, what can you learn from a study like this?
Well, we are attempting to find out what happens to a community when a disaster of this magnitude strikes. We feel that if we can find out, then we will have knowledge which may be of value to other communities in the nation or elsewhere who may be struck by a disaster, flood, tornado, explosion, whatever may come.
Well, I have a pretty good idea of what happens to a city physically in a tornado. But what happens to the people? How are they affected?
Well, let's explore a little.
All right. Where do we start?
Why not on the afternoon of May 11th, 1953, just after the tornado struck?
My name's Charlie Carver. I was driving down 5th Street towards Austin. It was raining very hard, and I couldn't see too well through the windshield, but everything seemed all right. And then all of a sudden, it was as though there was a house being moved ahead of me, coming towards me. But I realized they wouldn't be moving a house in all that weather, so I took another look, and buildings were strewn all over the streets. It was a bad sight. Just gave you a queer nightmare feeling all of a sudden.
All of a sudden, it started raining hard, real hard. And then hail started coming down as big as baseballs.
We were standing in the front door when we heard the tornado hit the trees in the backyard. We were scared to stay in the building, afraid it'd blow down, so we run out. We didn't know where to run immediately. It was raining so hard, so we run right side this little white building. By the time we got in there, the roof blew off of the building.
You see, one of the things we're trying to do is to discover patterns of mass behavior. We're also trying to find out whether there are definite stages through which a community goes in a situation of this sort. Now, from our interviews, we are fairly certain that there is a pretty definite reaction pattern. There's one reaction in particular which is typical, we believe.
I'm Glenda Cantrell, and I work for Modern Appliance Company. My story the day of the tornado was that I was going downtown to buy some records, and then I was going on home. And I went up to this music store and tried the door, and it was locked. And so I glanced at the glass windows, and they were broken. And so I walked on in, and I asked the clerk if he was open, and he looked at me sort of funny, and he said, well, I guess so. And so I bought some records from him, and then I walked on downtown. And I noticed some cars that had bricks piled on top of them, but still I didn't realize what had gone on. And I walked on past the dentist building, and I noticed it looked different. It was crumpled, but I didn't realize there were people in there. I didn't realize what a terrible thing had happened until after I got home, and I began listening to the radio, and then I was weak and sad, and I just really didn't know what had been going on.
Then she was just dazed, in a state of shock.
Yes, that's it exactly. There was no panic, no hysteria, nothing of that sort. The whole thing was incomprehensible. It was some hours before people came out of it and organized operations got underway. That's the way we designate the second phase of the tornado, the emergency relief period. I think that for a description of that, there's no better source than Mayor Ralph Wolf.
Mr. Romine, the number of lives lost in the tornado was 114. The number of persons injured, approximately 950. And the loss in money, property damage, was $57 million.
Now, what was it like in the actual path of the tornado immediately after it hit?
Everything was a shambles. The path of the tornado came in this direction, and it was approximately 5 to 7 blocks in width and about 5 miles in length. All of the services, especially in this devastated area, were knocked out. Our main difficulty, as soon as the tornado had passed, was the lack of any central authority to direct the rescue efforts. Within about 20 minutes, Connally Air Force Base had sent over 200 men and all of the equipment that they had in to help with the rescue. Fort Hood also sent men and equipment. Camp Walters, located north of here, also sent men and equipment in here. Had it not been for these military installations, which sent men and equipment into Waco, I don't know what we would have done. Right down in this area here, in the main business part of town, was the part which was the worst damaged in the whole city. The devastation was unbelievable. The job seemed overwhelming. When the city authorities came out of shock, we hardly knew where to begin. But we started to organize operations as best we could. There were people trapped in there, and we had to get them out.
I'm S.B. Turner of the Waco Police Department. I was at the R.T. Dennis building that day after the tornado to try and save my wife, who was trapped in the building and died in the building. I went in the old elevator shaft in the back and slid in through a transom. It was dark and lots of gas escaping. I went on down as far as I could go, crawling on my hands and knees. I could hear people screaming. I first got a Mexican girl, I don't know her name, got a beam off her legs, and she crawled on out. Then I got to Miss Patton, who had her arm smashed off, and I tried to console her as best I could and get help to get her out. She was a very brave lady, never did faint.
I was talking to Mrs. Patton when the lights went out and the building caved in. In the darkness, I could tell that her arm was pinned under something. So I decided I'd have to get out of there because I knew she was badly hurt. Well, I crawled in and out of holes until I reached the elevator shaft, and I fell down the elevator shaft. I had to come up by the cables. And when I finally got out on the top, I yelled for help. And 2 or 3 men came, and I told them where the people were. And they were taken out, injured, but alive.
I'm so grateful to all those who aided me, and especially Bee. If she hadn't helped me like she did, I don't think I'd be alive today.
The period of rescue operations was a long and painful one for many. In some cases, piles of rubble had to be removed with great care before the victim buried underneath could be reached.
I'm Dr. Aubrey Goodman. I had charge of the rescue work down by R.T. Dennis building on 5th and Austin, Waco, following the tornado itself. About 10 minutes to 9 that night, some of the rescue workers called me and asked me to come over to a certain area. They thought they had a living person which had been pinned down by debris. I went over there, and about 10 feet below the level where we were working, there was a lady who was pinned down. We could hear her voice, hear her talking. The boys started to work and started digging her out. That was around 9 o'clock. About 2 hours later, there was a slight cave-in of a debris, and we had a fear that our air might be shut off. So I called for an oxygen tank and mask, which they brought. When the tank and mask arrived, we tried to pass the mask itself down through the debris, but it was impossible. So we detached the mask from the tube itself and maneuvered the tube down to her. It was a little before 7 o'clock the next morning that we got out Miss Lily Matkin and took her on out to the hospital. She was a very brave woman, weren't you, Miss Lily?
Well, I suppose I was, Dr. Goodman, because I never was frightened, not the least bit at any time. And I could hear ambulances, and I could hear people talking, and I suppose I must have screamed so loud and so long until my voice had gotten so husky that when they did find me, they couldn't tell whether I was a man or a woman, and they asked me.
What was your reaction when you found out they'd heard you?
I just knew they were going to hear me. I had just asked the Lord to send me help, if not to take me on, that it was perfectly all right, but I didn't want to be pinned down like that. And I just felt like that my prayers were going to be answered.
By noon the next day, the Disaster Committee headquarters was set up in the First National Bank, which is immediately below us here on this roof, and immediately across the street from the worst damaged area in the city. We operated from that headquarters 24 hours a day for the next 4 days and nights. We slept whenever we had a chance on the floor or on cots. We had more problems pouring into that headquarters than we could cope with, and we learned many things in those 4 terrible days and nights.
Thousands of pedestrians, thousands of vehicles blocked the streets in the emergency area. After the first night, however, we were able to put a cordon around the area affected and thus make it possible for ambulances, fire trucks, wreckers, big equipment, other emergency vehicles to get to the scene where they were badly needed.
At that time, a civil defense organization existed merely on paper. No amount of unselfish, spontaneous activity can take the place of a well-trained, realistic civil defense organization.
One thing we did not foresee was the hundreds of visitors and loved ones that came out to see about the patients and crowded our halls.
The National Guard is on the street in minutes after the tornado. In fact, they're on the street before they'd had time to get new uniforms, which was a handicap to them, the public not knowing who they were and just thinking they were ordinary citizens.
We had volunteer workers coming into Waco from all sections of the country. These workers didn't know where to report to or to whom to report to. This posed quite a problem, and decisions had to be made, right or wrong. There had to be a final authority.
Well, that's about the way it went. Hundreds of unexpected problems were coming at us all the time and from all directions. But let's not forget the main fact, which is that the Disaster Committee met all of these problems and solved all of them. But we were only able to do this because of the full cooperation of all of the different forces in the community. All of the community agencies, welfare organizations, got into action immediately. The Red Cross organization set up first aid stations to take care of the injured who were injured in the tornado and to take care of those who were injured in the rescue work. They had mobile stations which moved around town in the different areas of devastation. The Salvation Army provided emergency shelter for the homeless, distributed food and clothing. The federal government provided money through the Federal Civil Defense Administration. The YMCA, the churches, and every welfare and social service group was in the fight for survival from the first hours until every one of the homeless had shelter. Every injured person brought to safety. Every victim accounted for. until the emergency phase of this disaster was ended.
Dr. Moore, can you sum up your research findings on this second period, the emergency phase of the disaster?
If the first phase was characterized by dazed uncertainty, then the second phase might be called that of intense effort. Everybody pitches in, goes to work. Leadership emerges, often in unlikely persons. The city begins to lick its wounds.
Now, what would you say, Dr. Moore, was the mass behavior pattern of this phase?
That would be characterized by a wave of generosity, almost complete selflessness. Everyone gave of himself, whether his physical strength or his goods. Merchants opened their stores, gave anything that was needed to anyone that asked for it, and with no thought of compensation. It was only later, after the emergency was over, that the reaction sets in.
A reaction? What kind of a reaction?
Well, when the job's too big, when the problem looks as if it can't be solved, then frustration may produce aggression. People begin to realize their losses and to look around for someone to blame, a scapegoat on whom they can release their emotional tension.
We wanted to salvage, and they told us they couldn't salvage right then. They come back the next day, nothing would be touched. The next morning we come back, everything was gone, including part of the cement floor. You can figure the shock that we had finding everything missing.
The tornado didn't do my barber shop any great damage. I was out of the city at the time the tornado hit. Came back in the next day afterwards. Unlocked my doors, walked in, and everything was intact. A few days later, came back down. Everything was gone, completely demolished. The bulldozers had wrecked and pulled down barbershop, building, and all.
I was so thankful my life was spared, but my store was badly damaged without 1 red cent of insurance.
Old conflicts are aroused, new ones are created. Relief organizations, even religious bodies, are accused of preposterous things, of cheating, of refusing relief, even of selling relief supplies. Organizations attack each other. Political campaigns may result. You see, the old world is gone. The new one is strange and frightening. People argue that they did nothing to deserve such treatment, hence someone else must have. But work and planning gradually relieve the tension. Things reapproach normal. This is the beginning of the rehabilitation phase, the readjustment period. Mr. Walter Delamora of the Council of Social Welfare and of the Waco Relief Fund Committee can tell you about these and show you something of what has been done.
There are 2 aspects of the problem. The first being the physical rebuilding of the city. The second being the human rehabilitation of human lives. Lives broken as a result of the tornado. Would you like to take a drive around the city?
Yes, I think that'd be a good idea.
Perhaps you can see just what we've been able to do. These newer residential areas here were the first to recover. Now, looking down this street, you'd hardly imagine how badly it was hit. The roofs are new, the buildings are freshly painted. Everything looks pretty peaceful and secure. But this is what the street looked like after the twister hit. These 1-story buildings here used to be 2-story and 3-story buildings, but they've just never been adequately repaired. I guess you could compare a city with a living organism in a way, in that the old and worn-out tissue that is injured doesn't come back as new and vital tissue does.
By the way, how was the money raised for all this rebuilding?
Well, we received the money from several different resources. There was the Red Cross and the Waco Disaster Fund and government agencies and Then the people just seemed to dig down in their pockets, and we collected over $10 million. Now, I'd like to tell you about another aspect of our rebuilding program in human terms.
I was located at 2nd and Bridge Street up over the Mecca drugstore. And when the tornado hit, well, it destroyed the building and all my equipment. Not anything was saved. I was injured and was laid up for about 4 months. And during that time, I was wondering how I was going to get set up again. And finally, the disaster fund came to my aid, and they set me up in the office in the rear of my residence at 1622 South 4th.
This is the Tillman home. Mrs. Odell, one of our caseworkers, is there now.
My daughter got killed at the Blue Front Cafe, and she left me 4 boys and 3 girls. And I'm living in a 3-room house, and I'm doing fairly well. I put them in school, and they've made good grades.
Well, what are you living on, Maddie?
Well, the disaster fund helps, and their father helps too. And I'm getting along fairly well.
Now, this is the home of Mr. and Mrs. Lee Crook and their son, Edward. All 3 were crushed in their car when a building collapsed on it down on 10th and Webster. You know, it's hard to believe, but Mrs. Crook had 42 bones broken in her body. I just can't imagine how she managed to survive.
Well, I guess I'm real lucky after all. Being hurt like I was, I had the best doctors in the world and the good nurses, good sisters at the hospital. And to beat it all, I didn't know that we'd had a tornado for several days. When I came to, I asked my husband where I was, and he said I was in Providence Hospital. And I said, yes, I told you if you didn't quit driving so fast, you was going to kill us all. And I guess I'm just as like the rest of the people that's been in a tornado. I'm doing the best I can to forget it and live a normal life.
That's the kind of optimistic attitude you'll find all over the city, even amongst those people that suffered the most and endured the greatest hardship. Of course, there are still those people that sort of live in the past, you know, and they just can't seem to understand why it had to happen to them. But that's just a few people.
Well, have there been many lasting psychological effects to the tornado?
Yes, there have been. You know, it's an interesting thing, but every time a dark cloud comes in over the city, people just get scared to death. And little kids run and hide, and the poor weatherman, they just about ring his phone off the hook. There's the First Methodist Church. It's one of the oldest churches in the city. It's pretty hard hit by the tornado, too. See, it's got a new steeple. Religion has been a real comfort to our people. It seems to have brought about an awakening. A tornado is a terrible thing, but it seems to have brought us closer together and bound us in a feeling of community spirit. It also seems to have brought about a feeling of brotherhood amongst us. Not only have we been brought closer together, but we've been brought closer to God.
In this research, we've been trying to find out how a community acts in a disaster and its aftermath, such as the one which struck Waco. We know far too little about the bonds which hold communities, families, even personalities together. Out of this research, we hope we have learned something. We believe, for instance, that pride in community, the more closely knit the social fabric, the more quickly and effectively a community or a family will recover from a disaster. We know that every city in the nation is subject to catastrophe in one form or another, and we are quite certain that the people of Waco, in telling us of their experiences, of their tragedy, of their successes, and of their failures, have helped our research project tremendously, and we hope have given us information which will be valuable to other cities and to people all over our nation.